A vanishing nomadic clan, with a Songlike language all their own. New genetic research confirms the oral history of a small group of nomadic people living in Indonesia's rainforest. The Punan people of the island of Borneo were once rumored to have tails, so elusive did they seem to their neighbors in the 19th century. Unlike the indigenous farmers, who lived in long houses, the Punan roamed the island's northern rainforest in family groups, hunting bearded pigs, harvesting starchy plants and gathering forest products for trade. They were not only misunderstood, but mistreated. Over decades, the Indonesian government stripped the Punan of their ancestral lands and encouraged them, sometimes forcibly, to settle in ready-built villages. By the 1990s, anthropologists believed that the group's traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle had vanished. In 2002, a census of the Punan in eastern Borneo focused only on the villages because so few nomads were thought to exist. And so in 2018, when Stephen Lansing, an anthropologist at the Santa Fe Institute, and Pradipta Jati Kusuma, a geneticist at the Mokhtar Riyadi Institute for Nanotechnology in Tangerang, Indonesia, said they had learned of a clan of about 30 Punan families who sheltered in limestone caves and rarely, if ever, emerged from the forest. Many experts were skeptical. But with funding from the National Science Foundation, the scientists made contact with the nomadic group in 2018 and began collecting data with the aim of ensuring their health and welfare. After that first trip, Dr. Lansing returned to Santa Fe with photographs of a man wearing a loincloth made of bark fiber, along with recordings of a song language he believed resembled no other. His initial description of these people, who call themselves the Cave Punan or Punan Bachu, was published last year in the journal Evolutionary Human Sciences. Press reports in the Indonesian media catalyzed the local government to declare the Punan Bachu as regular users of their forest, a first step toward obtaining the right to manage it under national laws. Some experts remain doubtful that this unusual group could really have been secluded for so long. The skeptics have compared the announcement to that of the Tasidae, a lost tribe discovered in the Philippines in 1971, whose isolation was eventually determined to be an exaggeration, if not a hoax. Bernard Cellato, a Punan specialist with the French National Center for Scientific Research, has been particularly fierce in his criticism. In an email, he referred to the Punan Bachu and other coastal groups as fake Punan. Based on historical accounts and ethnographies, he remains convinced their ancestors were not native to the island, but rather enslaved people imported from New Guinea and eastern Indonesia several centuries ago. But a new study focusing on the DNA of the Punan Bachu, recently accepted by a scientific journal, is poised to eliminate the doubts of all but the most hardened critics. Based on the limited diversity revealed in the genes of the Punan Bachu, they appear to have been isolated for more than 20 generations. Dr. Cellato's contention that the Punan Bachu are the descendants of imported slaves does not fit with these results. The new findings could also put to rest a century-old debate about when the Punan arrived in Borneo, and how they became hunter-gatherers in the first place. And the research could help make the case that the Punan Bachu deserve a hand in managing their forest, which is threatened by encroaching palm oil plantations and commercial forestry operations. What they desperately want, Dr. Lansing said, is to stop the destruction of their forests. The Punan mystery. Borneo, the third largest island in the world, is covered by rugged mountains, rainforests and swamps. Its population of 21 million is divided between three countries, Malaysia and the tiny Kingdom of Brunei, to the north, and Indonesia, which controls 3/4 of the territory in the south. The island's population has been shaped by waves of migration. Caves in the north were used by Stone Age hunter-gatherers at least 50,000 years ago, when a land bridge linked the island to mainland Southeast Asia. Contemporary indigenous groups, collectively known as the Dayak, are thought to have arrived by sea from Taiwan 4,000 to 6,000 years ago, bringing domesticated rice with them. Where the Punan came from is unclear. Other parts of Southeast Asia are home to scattered groups of hunter-gatherers who share a suite of physical features including dark skin, a short stature and tight, curly hair. They are the descendants of the first wave of modern humans who departed from Africa more than 60,000 years ago and made their way east, where they encountered and sometimes mixed with now extinct hominins. On Borneo, however, the only hunter-gatherers that early European explorers encountered, the Punan, looked similar to the farming Dyaks, and many Punan groups, including the nomadic Punan Bachu, had long established trade relationships with settled communities. By the mid-1700s, a Muslim kingdom known as Bulungan controlled part of the northeast coast. According to legend, after the Punan Bachu failed to deliver the Sultan a wife, they appeased him with nests of swiftlet birds from the forest, which were exported to China, where they were prized for bird's nest soup. The Punan Bachu performed risky work for the Sultan, collecting nests from the caves and honey from treetops, along with rattan and fragrant agar wood. In exchange, the Sultan gave them tobacco, rice and metal tools. Though they were no longer exclusively reliant on wild food staples, they remained isolated. In 1903, a Dutch resident described them as being at the lowest level of development. 30 years later, another Dutchman, a geologist, referred to them as a backward group, which almost does not mix with other Punan. Even after the Sultanate dissolved in 1959 and its territory became an Indonesian regency, the family maintained control of its forest resources. Abdul Karim, a valuable man in his late 60s and a descendant of the Sultanate, said that as recently as the 1980s one of his older relatives, Prince Har, treated the Punan Bachu almost as his slaves. Har was really strict to the Punan, Karim said, telling them, "You stay in the forest, you cannot go to the city." Scientists, in the meantime, have long questioned the notion of a Punan identity. In 1945, Faye Cooper Cole, an anthropologist who had defended natural selection during the Scopes monkey trial, argued that the Punan were not full-time hunter-gatherers. He suggested that they were villagers out camping. Later researchers noted that Punan groups in different regions spoke different languages, which were more closely related to those of neighboring Dayak communities than to other Punan. The Punan, they suggested, were actually Dayak who had abandoned agriculture to focus their activities on the forest. When might this bear fruit? Dr. Lansing came to Borneo after spending 40 years studying rice farmers on a far more developed Indonesian island, Bali. There, he found that a 1,000-year-old system of coordinating irrigation and planting through regular gatherings at local temples provided greater yields than did the application of fertilizer and pesticides. His work led, in 2012, to the designation of the water temple landscape as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Over the last decade, he began collaborating with researchers at one of Indonesia's preeminent genetics laboratories in an attempt to understand human migration across the archipelago. During a trip to Borneo in 2017, he and Dr. Kusuma first heard a report about the Punan Bachu from a self-appointed Punan leader from another area, Thomas Mita. Mr. Mita offered to guide the researchers there, for a steep price. In his grant proposal with the National Science Foundation, Dr. Lansing described how he would be making first contact with the Punan Bachu, a bold claim that contributed to early concerns about his credibility. Experts did not believe there were any uncontacted indigenous groups in Borneo. It was only after Dr. Lansing paid Mr. Mita to take him there in 2018 that he learned Mr. Mita had previously brought in other foreigners. "I guess he was running little tours to discover the exotic primitives," Dr. Lansing said. Far from being discouraged by such stage management, the incident piqued his curiosity, for the people he met were practicing a nomadic, subsistence lifestyle that no longer existed in other parts of Borneo. When Dr. Lansing was planning to return in 2019 with 3 other scientists, he invited me and a photographer to accompany him. The group planned to spend 5 days camping with the nomads, conducting interviews and handing out GPS ankle bracelets to record their movements. A dozen or so Punan Bachu met us on our first morning at Abdul Karim's trading post, where the Indonesian Ministry of Health held a monthly medical clinic for them. In the afternoon, we all climbed into a small fleet of motorized canoes for the journey up the Saa River. The long-tail engines snarled and popped as the boats seesawed over fallen logs and jolted up small rapids. 3 hours up the meandering river, we arrived at our first campsite, Dr. Lansing and his entourage disembarked from the canoes and, the following day, climbed the lower flanks of a small mountain, guided by the Punan Bachu and their pint-sized brown hunting dogs. The men cleared a trail through the muddy forest while the women carried their infants and possessions in baskets on their backs. One man held a blowgun and wore a loincloth with blue gym shorts underneath. A young boy whose family no longer lived full-time in the forest had a machete-like knife slung across his shoulders. His eyes were glued to a cell phone in his hands, though there was no reception.